What's up, guys? This is Tom for GTO Wizard. Today we have a hand played between two 500 NL streamers, MattRoberts and CeeGee. We're going to analyze the hand, view the replay, get their thoughts, and then compare their ideas against the GTO solution. Let's get started.
Joshy, you're probably not running the same, you probably don't have the same sims that I do. I use GTO Wizard, 500 basic sims. So if you want to look at the frequencies of my plays, you can check out GTO Wizard. Lead's not terrible. I'm probably supposed to mix raise and call.
Hey, so this is an interesting hand that I played with CeeGee the other day. The first thing to mention is 10-9 suited is probably a mix pre. I would fold this sometimes, if not most of the time, versus a 3-bet in these positions. Now the flop comes 8-5-4 rainbow, and I thought this could be a board that I potentially want to donk on. The reason is because we'll have 8-8, 5-5, 4-4, 7-6 at likely a higher frequency than button. But I think it's really dependent on the range in your sim and also the size that you used. I used 33 in game, but honestly, maybe a smaller size might be better. And obviously the smaller you bet, the more often you could bet. So maybe potentially using a 33, this hand might not even fit into that range, but we did it anyways.
This is CeeGee, and I wanted to give my thoughts on the hand with MN-Roberts. So this is me reviewing myself. It's a little meta, but I think at the time, when you're playing a hand, you don't always get a lot of your thoughts through clearly. So I just wanted to elaborate on something maybe I said in the hand. So the 3-bet is a pretty standard spot, button versus under the gun. We've played a lot together in the pool, and I don't have any solid reads so far as to have a reason to deviate from what I think is close to the equilibrium. So I generally play as close to the equilibrium as I can when I'm playing against him. So he takes a lead line here, and I think that is a pretty good thing to do. How I'm supposed to respond to it, I wasn't really sure. I knew that I was at least supposed to call at a frequency, so if I do know that something is a mixed strategy, I tend to lean towards potentially the more passive side of it if I feel like maybe they're leading a disproportionate amount of hands that they're going to fold. So you do hear that from me where I decide to mix. I rolled the RNG and I did get a 92, so that kind of reinforced my thought of just calling. That being said, there might be an exploit here that I might not find.
So Matt opens under the gun. CeeGee 3-bets on the button with kings, and Matt calls with 10-9 of clubs. Flop is 8-5-4 rainbow, a very interesting flop. This is the kind of flop that's better for the defender than the aggressor. We can see in the ranges tab that Matt actually has more equity despite being pre-flop defender. And this is because they have more straights, sets, and a little more 2-pair in range. In the equity distribution, we can see a reasonable range advantage throughout, and that's mainly owing to the fact that under the gun will have more middling made hands, whereas the 3-better will have more ace-high kind of air. Near the top, we can see that nut advantage owing to the extra straights and sets in range. The next question to ask is, how can we extend this analysis a bit further? How can we find some underlying trends? Well, if we take a look at the aggregate reports, we can see that these middling cards do tend to be bet a bit more. And in fact, if we apply a filter, for example, rainbow connected and somewhere between 5 and 9 high, we can see that the donking range increases to almost 40%, indicating that these kind of boards are excellent donking boards. I'm sure Matt uses a very similar heuristic, which is why he found this donk bet. Now at this point, I'm going to switch over to the general solutions because these ones don't actually have Matt's size. In the general solutions, button is using a smaller 3-bet, under the gun is using a smaller open, and we use a 33% donk bet instead of 18. And because you're using a 33% donk bet, it doesn't actually choose the donk very often. Nevertheless, the range is there, and Matt did donk. So He also mentions in his analysis that perhaps a smaller donk bet would mean you can donk more often, which would be theoretically correct. But I think it's going to be very close either way, and I think this donk bet is playable. So action's on CeeGee, and he indicates that he knows this is a raise or fold spot. We can see that kings in particular are one of the best hands to raise. And that's because kings is one of the few overpairs that's stronger than Matt's strongest overpairs, which is queens. Of course, it does mix calls, and in the basic solution, it is also calling at some frequency. Overall, we can see that button is raising very aggressively here, using, well, of course, mostly overpairs for value. And this is to compensate for the fact they have to overfold in position, or theoretically, they need to give under the gun a worse price on a donk bluff. And they do that by compensating for their overfolding by raising quite a bit. Now, calling is also playable, so Matt finds the call.
See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. He leads and the nut card comes for him. He's going to have sevens, he's going to have 6-7 suited, he's going to have sixes, he's going to have some threes and twos. But overall, like, we're not going to have a lot of this board. We're not going to have a lot of 6x to call with. So we're going to be forced to call.
Turn is the 7 of clubs, which is really good for my flop donking range. So I think if I bet flop, I'm probably continuing likely my full range here for a small size again. I think maybe you could entertain a check raise, but I think betting is probably just better.
The turn is decent for him. He's going to have some 7-6 type combos that pick up a pair. He's going to have some 8-7 suited maybe. He might have sixes or sevens. And against that range, I don't think we can really raise anymore.
So we turn the 7 of clubs. Both players recognize that this is a really good card for under the gun's range. Matt concludes that he's going to continue to bet for a small size with most of his range, as is a common strategy after you've donk bet the flop. CeeGee indicates that this is such a strong card for Matt that he doesn't think he'll do much raising against this size. If we check the turn reports, we can see that 6s and 7s are among the most barreled cards. They also give under the gun a pretty significant EV advantage as compared to most turns. Let's take a look at the ranges tab to see how the ranges break down. Here we can see that under the gun has many more straights, sets, 2-pair, and proportionally more overpairs than button. That may be surprising because button was the pre-flop aggressor, but under the gun's range is tighter. Now, conversely, button has more trash, particularly more ace-high trash. And that's reflected in the equity graph where we can see a pretty big range advantage for under the gun throughout. Let's see how the solver constructs its range. In the breakdown tab, we can see that the 1/3 range is actually mainly used by overpairs, particularly jacks and queens, whereas the larger 75% size as well as the 50% size are typically centered more around sets and straights. Regardless, Matt decides to bet small again, and CeeGee makes the call with his kings. We can see the solver isn't really raising too much here, a little over 13%, but most of its range is middling equity, so it can't get too out of line. So we make the call.
Yeah. I mean, the most intuitive bluffs here are deuces and threes, and then maybe some like broadways. What do we want to have to call? I don't have enough time to think here. I don't think he's going to bluff enough here.
River is the jack of hearts, and I think this is where the hand gets really interesting. So when I'm in a situation like this, I ask myself, how do I maximize my EV with my hand or my range? So what are my options? Number one, we could check and hope that imposition bluffs or value bets enough and then get value in the check raise line. We could maybe bet small, again hoping for a value raise or bluffs. Or 3, just bet a size that I think my hand can get enough calls with. In game, I use shove, which I think is fine in practice. However, in theory land, I don't know if it's a thing because I'm likely folding all the overpairs with this size, which is my main value target. So maybe I would prefer a bet still, but maybe smaller, or maybe going for a check raise as well. That could potentially be an option. I guess it depends on how you want to play. Do you want to play a more theory-oriented style? Or are you trying to play more exploitative when you get to the river? What's my perception of villain here? Will he open enough if I bet Like, will he bet all those overpairs that he probably should? I think it's a fair question to ask. And honestly, I'm not sure. And I think it's an interesting spot. And I think it's worth looking at in solver, even though it's not a high frequency spot. I think we could potentially learn a few lessons so that if I ever do face a spot like this again, I'll be better prepared.
So just pausing, in my thought process, I didn't think that he would have led 10-9 suited or that he would raise call it from out of position. My thought was 10-9 suited was a pure fold if you were to open it from low jack versus a button 3-bet. That being said, I think it's probably okay to call it a frequency. I looked it up after and it is a call at like a quarter or third of the time frequency. But it wasn't a hand that I was particularly like afraid of, because if it was a call versus a 3-bet, it wasn't a very high frequency one. So when it came to having a blocker for this run out, it's kind of hard to have a 10 in our hand unless we have 10s or 9s. But thinking about it now, it's probably significant to have a 10 if we can as a blocker. So when he does inevitably jam here, I'm not happy, clearly. So I think that I use the term intuitive bluff because a lot of the times there's some difficult bluffs to find in an equilibrium. And this is one of those boards that I don't think people are generally leading Queen 10 suited very often, although it would be good. It is a hand in low jack's range here for leading. So in those scenarios, I tend to fold more against players where if I think that a lot of the bluffs that they need to have here at the equilibrium are unintuitive, that they'll be under bluffing and they'll be more geared towards value. So in this spot, I think I knew it was a very close decision for me because we're not going to have too many really strong hands to call down here with. But I did think that he was probably a little light with his bluffs here.
So the river's the Jack of Hearts. This is a very interesting card because it completes Matt's exact straight draw, which is very disguised, but it's not fantastic for his overall range. In the equity distribution graph, we can see that Under the Gun has a pretty significant equity advantage throughout the middle, but they don't have the nut advantage near the top. And whenever you see this pattern, you can expect that the solver will use lots of small sizes, pushing its middling equity advantage. Matt wants to get the most value with his hand, and there's a few ways to go about doing that. Of course, you can check raise, you can block bet, hoping for a raise, or you can just bet large yourself. We can see that the block bet here is mostly constructed using top pairs and under pairs for value, disguising and protecting itself with a few sets and straights. Larger bets, in fact, let me just group some of these together, are mainly used by straights and sets with very little top pair in there. So Matt decides he wants to go for a shove. Actions on CeeGee, who has a very difficult decision with kings. Now CeeGee indicates that the natural bluffs here are not so easy to find, and that may indicate a value imbalance. If so, he should be overfolding. So let's take a look. What are the natural bluffs, or the solver bluffs, in Under the Gun's range? Let's start by filtering for the all-in. We can see it's using king-queen as a bluff and sixes for value. And in this exact case, of course, kings blocks king-queen, so probably want to fold. But this is quite a narrow range, so let's expand this. We can see that the trash hands are all these overcards. King-queen, king-10, ace-queen, queen-10, whereas the value range are all the lower cards. So he has a hand that blocks most of the bluffs, but doesn't block most of the value. For that reason, facing a large bet, kings is mostly folding. And we can see that kings should be a 0 EV call, or very close to it, because it's mixing folds. CeeGee sniffs it out and correctly lays down his cowboys. What a great hand by both players. Alright, that's it for the video, guys. We hope you like and subscribe. Feel free to comment, and of course, join our Discord if you'd like to discuss the theory further. That's all for now.